Good evening, everybody. On behalf of both Haringey Council and the NEU, because we've jointly organised this event, I want to thank everybody for coming and braving what has been such horrible weather. I know that we British are so hardy and determined to come out in all weathers, except, of course, when you go canvassing, in which case you go to the cafe instead. I want to thank everybody, as I said, for coming for what I hope will be the first of an annual lecture to honour the memory of my very best friend, Julie Davies, and all the family here. I'm going to say a few words about Julie, but first I want to say that we're absolutely honoured to have Professor Danny Dorling from Oxford University, who's going to do the first of our hope, as I said, our annual lectures, and speaking on a subject which we all care about and which was so pertinent and so relevant to Julie, which is about the issues of education, inequality in education, and how we can address some of those issues. And I can't tell you how grateful we are that you have found time to come and speak here in Haringey in Bruce Castle Museum. So I'm just going to say just a few words about Julie, and I'm going to hand over to Perai, who is the leader of the council. Julie was my friend for over 20 years, and as I said at her funeral, we did bond over a shopping trolley and Tesco's in Lee Valley when we were caught up in campaigns to stop our local education authority being privatised. So I suppose that set the tone for the next 20 years. She was a passionate advocate for education and for equality in education, and a passionate feminist for the rights of educators, for the rights of teachers, and for having a fair and level playing field in education. So, a few words about her. I thought she was incredibly adventurous, fearless, and somebody who could make you fall about laughing. She had a most wonderful sense of humour, often very cynical, very caustic, but always really funny. A totally committed trade unionist, which is why it's so great that the NEU here locally has seen fit to honour her memory. And she followed on from Tony Brockman, who's here tonight, who was president of the NEU. And because Haringey is so good at all union stuff, we have Ed Harlow here, who's the current president of the NEU and was the recent secretary of the local branch. Working with Tony, and then after she took over, she built what is the biggest branch, I think, in the country. Certainly, I'm told, the biggest for strike ballots and getting the vote out. And she was, I think, very fair, very even-handed. Of course, those of us who knew her so well knew that perhaps she wasn't loved by many head teachers. However, I would say that she had an amazing set of skills for representing people, a fervent advocate for fairness, and skills, knowledge, brilliant negotiating, and had an unparalleled knowledge of HR, which of course would drive most head teachers up the wall. However, she was a formidable opponent, but wiser heads, one of whom is here tonight, made her their friend, and they knew that it would help manage their schools. Well, I miss her terribly, and I know a lot of people here miss her terribly. And I will always remember her. She subsequently became a councillor, and she loved being on the council. Julie really did relish all the argument, all the debate. She was the Madame Defarge of the Labour group and doing all her knitting while the rows were going on. And it is a tragedy and a great loss that she wasn't able to see out her term and continue on the council doing the great work she was doing, especially, I would say, in culture and parks and at this museum. So thank you all for coming and for making this a very special event. I'm going to hand over to Perai to say a few words on behalf of the council and all our councillors. And when Danny has finished, I know Ed is going to say a few words on behalf of the NEU. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Zena. And I know Zena spent a lot of time thinking of a fitting way to commemorate Julie. We did think about naming a building after her, but I think Harry was like, no, Mum wouldn't have wanted that. So a memorial lecture seems much more fitting for the woman from Romford, and I think she would have preferred that, although I'm still up for naming a building because we are building a lot of council homes, so I'm sure if you're up for it, Harry, I'm sure we can commemorate her in that way too. Now, I spent some time preparing for tonight, and this is an in-joke, so I do apologise, but for those of you who were councillors and are councillors, you remember there was some WhatsApp groups called Dispossessed, and I was going through some of that. And one day, Harry, I'll share with you and Ted first, but I mean, that just captured Julie and her whole essence. Now, Julie is obviously remembered for her role in the NEU, at the NUT at the time, where she fearlessly took on lots of people, not least head teachers, as we'll all remember. But when Julie passed, she was a member of my cabinet, and she led on culture, amongst other things. She was a sitting member of the cabinet and a councillor. And this very building we're in today, we got some money to refurbish, and that was really, Julie was so driven for that, because she wanted to make sure that culture was accessible to all. And she was quite tired, particularly people who lived in Tottenham, not having access to cultural institutions in the same way that they do in the west of the borough. And we do have our fabulous MP, Catherine West, with us today, who represents Hornsey Free and Barnet. But Julie just wanted that equity. Just because we live in Tottenham, it didn't mean that we shouldn't have the same access. And she fought really, really hard. Now, Julie passed before we went on to win the London Borough of Culture last year. But that was really a big part of that win was because of Julie's drive and commitment to that. When she was in that role, she made sure we got in a culture team. I think we had one person in the culture team, and Deborah, maybe two. And Julie really fought hard to build a team, and really so the legacy is about Julie. And when we have London Borough of Culture in 2027, and we're going to make sure Julie's remembered, because if it wasn't for Julie driving that through, we wouldn't be spending a whole year celebrating all that's great and fabulous about Tottenham and Hornsey and Wood Green and the like. So a big thank you. We will never forget her, and I've got lots and lots of stories, because it was wonderful being on the council with Julie. It really was. We had lots of laughs, lots of arguments, and I'm still here to tell the story. But it's really good to see her family here and her friends and people who I know meant so much to her. And now on to the main talk of tonight. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here, and on behalf of the council, thank you to the NEU for sponsoring the event. I just want to say a few words about our speaker. I really was absolutely so excited when you agreed to come, and I saw you in that awful room at that hotel. Because it's Labour, it's got to be a terrible room, and and cold and miserable. How just like the government, really. Anyway, I really was so honoured that you said you would come, because, as I said, I couldn't think of a person more fitting to give a lecture on subjects that Julie really cared about. And Danny is a professor of human geography at Oxford, and I think you were at Sheffield University, and as an author of a myriad of books. I thought the most recent was called Seven, which I, of course, had to go out and read to prepare for this. And I have read it, actually, not usual, like I usually say, Alan's read something and I just pretend that I've read it. And most recently, a book which is called The Next Crisis, which might be out of date because I think the crisis is actually here now. Anyway, it's absolutely marvellous to have someone who's committed to equality and to education, and who has studied, and all these tables all about income distribution and all the rest of it that are throughout the book. And I'm going to hand over to you and to say thank you once again for coming.
Thank you. thanks ever so much for the invite. Thanks for coming. I'm not going to speak for that long because I want to do lots of short questions and answers because that's much more interesting, at least to some of you who ask questions, than what I have to say. I want to try and be optimistic because it's very easy not to be. And I was trying to think where to start. Now this place, this building, which I've never been to before, is famous for many things, and many things to do with education. But the thing that caught my eye was that one of the past residents of this place invented the first stamp. And that's connected to poverty and inequality. This was, I think, in the 1840s. The stamp you could stick on. Before then, the person who received the letter had to pay for the letter. But the stamp meant that you could actually send it and they would get it regardless. But of course, when this began in the 1840s, this was a privileged thing. Only people with money could possibly afford to buy a stamp. But things got better. And often you don't notice that things get better. Often you notice how shabby the rooms are that you're having in meetings, that although you look back and say it was fun, at the time of the meetings it was probably quite argumentative. And you thought, where are we getting? Let's go back to the stamp. The stamp was invented by the resident of this place in the 1840s. By 1899, there was a young man, the son of a chocolate factory owner in York. The chocolate factory owner was called Joseph Rowntree. Joseph had built this enormous factory. He was like Willy Wonka. And he started a soup kitchen in York, I think in the 1850s. What philanthropists did, what rich men did if they cared a little bit, is fund soup kitchens, because they couldn't stand the idea of watching people starving. His son, Seaborn, wanted to go a bit further than that, and so did a survey of the citizens of York, who had to fill it in because most of them worked in his dad's factory, but a survey where he looked at their income but also asked them what they could afford to have. And there were two particular items that he said that they needed to have. One was the ability to buy some cocoa every week, and as the factory made cocoa, you could see the vested interest. But the other was to be able to buy a stamp. It was to be able to buy a stamp, to be able to send a letter to a loved one, and that was part of the minimum income standard, if you like, in his survey of 1899. And that was revolutionary in terms of thinking. Because before then, you would have just said, well, as long as people have a bit of warmth and they have enough food, and maybe we'll just teach them to read and write, partly because we want them to read the Bible, but other than that, we're not that bothered. But the idea that people had a right to the ability to be able to send a letter to a loved one, with 2 days before Valentine's Day, so it fits. Now, Seaborn Rowntree, later on, as an old man, ended up on the committee chaired by William Beveridge to bring in the welfare state. Things are getting better and better. And interestingly, politically, the Rowntree family were liberals. They were partly liberals because there wasn't any much Labour back then, so liberal was the most radical thing you could be. But also they were rich. But they weren't actually detrimental. In the long run to what was going on, Seaborn was the nerd who provided the figures for the Beveridge report. And Beveridge was a liberal lord. This is an incredible time of change. The Rowntree report, published in 1901, showed how extensive poverty was in York. There was another report in 1936, don't worry, I'm not going to go on forever. There's another report in 1936 that showed it got worse. You could see how depressed people might be. I always think of 1936 as a little like now, in terms that you had fascists, they were posh, you didn't know what was going to happen. By 1938 it was fairly obvious that war was coming, at least to the upper classes. Mass unemployment, poverty was a problem. By 1952, when Seaborn did his final survey of York, he could hardly find any poverty at all. Incredible change. The welfare state had been implemented, there was full employment, things had got utterly better. And if you'd said in 1936, in that small number of years, 16 years, you'll have this transformation, people just wouldn't have believed you. And it isn't just a transformation in terms of this incredible reduction in what was seen as poverty. It was a transformation in many other things. And I think it's worth remembering. We nationalised the hospitals. We didn't build a National Health Service. We couldn't afford to build one. We nationalised the charity and the private hospitals. We managed to do that all in one go, with the result that by 1951, 1952, very, very shortly, we had the highest life expectancy in the world, except for 6 small countries that combined had a lower population than us when you put them all together. So, the best health in the world. In the 1930s, our health was I'm very glad I haven't got any slides for you, but I show you, it was a bimodal distribution. There were areas of the country where people died very young and others where they did a bit better, but we were completely split. That bimodal distribution had just disappeared by 1951. That's health. Housing, it began earlier, but particularly after the war, and not just by Labour, we managed to build the best social housing system in the world. Now, that isn't just because we're great. We weren't actually invaded in the Second World War, apart from one Channel Island or two, and we still had the remnants of an empire. We were rich. But we had so much social housing that in the 1946 birth cohort, which is one of the studies done to see how health changes, it's all the children born in 1 week in 1946, everybody, at least in all of England. A majority of those children, completely representative sample, you just have to be born in that week, a majority of those children at some point in their childhood lived in a council house. That's an incredible achievement to have got. And of course what they were not living in was slum housing. And what they were not living in was private rented housing, which was what 90% of people had been living in. And we got rid of that scourge incredibly quickly. And then education. I like to think a bit slower with education. We made it free, but we still had grammar schools and secondary moderns. I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be standing in front of you if we hadn't abolished the grammar schools. I couldn't read a word. I was the slowest child in my class of 30. I couldn't read a word until I was 8 years old. I'd have had no chance of passing the 11 plus. Right? Now you may think I shouldn't be allowed to be through, but our system of comprehensive education, which the vast majority of counties adopted, was the most progressive system in the world. For the first time, all children in a local area, bar a few, went to the nearest school. And when it first came in, it was often the nearest, because there wasn't a hierarchy necessarily of schools. And the results were incredibly good. Other countries have copied this. So Finland, they came, they looked at what we did in the 60s, they implemented it in Finland. This is a slow and steady progress, which I've given you an incredibly fast summary of, which involved a huge amount of fights to achieve what was being achieved. And was done right across the political spectrum. So it wasn't just some liberals. Labour tended to always be the most progressive, but not everybody in Labour. But the Conservatives also built a lot of council houses and did not, in the 1950s and the 60s when they're in power, and the 70s, did not dismantle what had been done. The whole lot shifted and was more and more progressive. And then, of course, things begin to turn around. I think we kind of ran out of money, in that we had done this partly on the spoils of empire, and we couldn't quite stomach the next stage, which would have been taking away the wealth of the very rich. To be able to carry on doing this, you couldn't carry on funding private schools. Only Chile spends more money on its private schools than we do as a country. But our government invented assisted places to keep the private schools going, particularly in the 60s and 70s. They would have collapsed because the country was more equal. We could do this because we were the most effective economy in Europe, because we'd been bombed, but we hadn't had tanks come over us and so on. But carrying on doing it, we stumbled. We stumbled in the late 1970s. The Callaghan government probably stumbled. The Thatcher government unwound an enormous amount, but had a belief. And I think this is often, and I do not like the Thatcher government, but they're not as vicious as you might think. In 1986, Margaret Thatcher signed up to the World Health Organization Target 1, which was to reduce inequalities in people's chances of dying between areas and between social classes, I think by half, by the year 2000. So she actually thought, and I think quite a lot of her cabinet thought, that what they were doing was going to make the country more equal. No, it didn't. We got the very opposite of that. We went, in terms of income, from being the second most equal large country in Europe after Sweden. We were essentially Nordic when I was growing up. From being the second most equal to the second most unequal after Bulgaria. Right? It's an incredible. No other European country has done this. It's gone from one extreme to the other. The poorest 20% of people in the UK are now poorer, and have been for many years, than the poorest 20% in absolute terms in most of Eastern Europe. It's quite incredible to achieve that and still have incredibly rich people living here. So the reality is we became really unequal. But at least they were not planning for that to happen. And what worries me more recently, and this is why I think in some ways that we're back to 1930s, is that you don't hear actual talk of trying to reduce inequalities, say, of the level that Margaret Thatcher signed up to in 1986. Can you imagine the current government saying, we will halve in the next 14 years the inequality in areas of your chances of dying, of infants' chances of dying, compared to those who are best off? So we are kind of in a dark place at the moment. These things are seen as not possible. Our attention is often completely absorbed by what's happened in the last week. We have quite a lot of scandals, but we've had crises and so on. So we look at what's happened in the last week, and that matters to us. And we don't see where progress has happened and when things have gone backwards. We still have a National Health Service. There's a threat to it, but it is still there. We don't have much of a National Education Service anymore, because academies are a form of privatising schools, and all our universities in effect were largely privatised in 2012 when £9,000 a year fees came in. Housing. Housing is one of the worst ones. I think it's about 1 in 3 children in England are now growing up in private renting with security of tenure of only 2 months. That was never the aim of introducing the assured hold tenancy. It wasn't to end up with families with small children being housed precariously. But that is what has happened. So that's the depressing point we've got to. And then the turning around. I've got less than 5 minutes left. The turning around takes you unexpectedly, and you tend not to notice it when things get better. Partly because you tend to be angry, so it's not good enough. So if there is any improvement, it's so far away from what you want that you're angry at the time. You can look back and say, look what we achieved, didn't we do well? But when the money was coming to refurbish this place, there'll have been other things going on which will have made people angry. In the last couple of weeks, kind of things that have really surprised me, with a whole set of colleagues, I was involved in a book called All at Once, which was basically a set of policies that a John McDonnell, Jeremy Corbyn administration might think of doing, which is normal, boring European social democracy. That's what the politics are. And we produced this book last year, and I thought, why are we bothering? Andy Burnham gave a speech. Where did this speech come from? From that book. This is just within 2 weeks. Now, it may be that Andy Burnham's playing a really sly game. Or it might be, which is possible, and this is sinister. Or it might be that being Mayor of Manchester for an amount of time has made him realise that things are pretty bad. And he actually thinks that these kind of things are palatable. Now, optimism. We are in a particular moment that is interesting, and this is where I make the mistake of looking at the last few weeks' news. On the Labour side, now I'm not quite sure if it's Tony Blair, but I think it's Peter Mandelson, but somebody here will be able to correct me. Do you remember the quote of, I don't mind what the rich earn as long as they pay their taxes? Go on?
Yeah. Intensely relaxed about it.
Intensely relaxed.
Yes.
Blair? It was Mandelson. It was Mandelson. It's brilliant. You should really look through all the things that Peter Mandelson said. I can remember when Peter Mandelson advocated the £9,000 a year university fees, and when Labour came out of office in 2010, he handed it on to David Willits, who implemented it. So there's a whole legacy of things associated. It's not just Peter Mandelson. And Peter Mandelson is not particularly special. Peter was just caught. He could easily have not been caught.
Well, he wasn't for a long time.
He wasn't caught for a long time. And the irony is, he was only caught because President Trump decided to release whatever it is, 3 million files. But it won't just be Peter. It won't just be Peter whose actual beliefs were that a small set of people are super able and they need to decide policy for the rest. And it's okay if we have very, very rich people, kind of as long as they pay their taxes, or maybe even as long as we think they're paying their taxes. That kind of thinking was, and it still is, fairly widespread. There were only 2 leaders of the Labour Party in Peter Mandelson's time, which stretches from the 1980s, who wouldn't work with Peter Mandelson. Who are they?
Gordon Brown.
No, John Smith and Jeremy Corbyn. In effect, he was almost Gordon Brown's sort of deputy. And Gordon Brown's doing a very, I'm aware of the camera, and I always try to be careful and polite.
Performative denouncing.
What could be called performative denouncing. I wrote a review of Gordon Brown's most recent book, which none of you will have read, I'm sure. It's published, I think, last year or the year before, written with 2 bankers about how the world works. And it's all basically neoliberal economics. So Brown's belief, very good at doing a talk to a Labour Party which is all about a crusade to end poverty, but another world which is to do with banking and finance, which is separate. Or the thing that might annoy some of you the most, to stir you up because I need questions now. It is not that difficult to take 1 million children who are just below the poverty line and improve lives a little bit so that statistically they're just above a poverty line. But it doesn't actually alter the lives of those families of children noticeably, and it's incredibly easy to reverse. Sold as a great achievement. If I was going to talk about the great achievements in the Labour period, it would be double glazing in council houses, which they didn't talk about Maybe a bit of sure start, but we're not quite sure. So, we're currently in a period of re-evaluation where the Labour Party is no longer in opposition. You can no longer have arguments saying this might be good, that might work. We're in government. And they're in government with 400 MPs. So when things don't work and you're in government and you've got 400 MPs, you either say it is impossible to make things that much better that quickly at all. We've got to wait for growth. And watch your popularity slide and slide and slide. Or reevaluate what your priorities were and where you moved as a party. From the time of Joseph Rowntree's politics in the 1850s through to Seabourn in the early 1900s through to Beveridge in 1942, the entire middle class slowly and grudgingly was moving more progressively to the left, including in the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1970s. That's how you end up with the second lowest income inequality in Europe, barring Sweden. And then from the late 70s, the whole lot has moved to the right. And that's why you end up with a Conservative Party that in 2014 left the European Conservative bloc and allied itself with Alternative for Deutschland and another set of far-right parties. That's why you end up with Labour taking the position that the Conservatives used to have. That's why you have Liberals skedaddling all over the place. It's why you end up with a far, far right party currently leading in the polls. But it's about as far as you can go. It's extreme, and it gets uncovered by WhatsApp messages, by people making payments, by general cynicism, by asking why did this company donate £4 million, what's in it for them? And you need that. You need that cynicism to begin to turn things around. And I think that's the point at which we're at the moment. We've just had the worst cost of living crisis, I think, in our history. We have the biggest increase in child poverty in every OECD country that's been measured. Somebody has to be in that situation, but we already had a high rate. We've reached a point of desperation. And at that point, different things become possible. People can begin to say different things. And at the moment, you're watching them skedaddling around, not wanting to be associated with what a lot of people have been ever so proud of for about 20 years. And it's an interesting period to be in. I'm not pessimistic about it, because it is so not in the interest of the vast majority of people to carry on as we are. A last example, because we're talking about education. When the student loans were first introduced, do you remember who's the pundit? Martin from Moneybox? Martin Lewis. Okay. I wrote 2 obscure papers with a colleague for the Progressive Economy Forum, saying that these student loans were terrible and were going to take you a lifetime to pay off, and were going to affect the mortgage market, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but for those of you who think you're going to retire on selling your house to a middle-class person in future, they've got to pay their student loan back. And in the last 2 weeks, we finally had a realisation that yes, 3% plus RPI on a 30-year term means you're not going to have any money left. And the second plan, the most recent plan, RPI, but for 40 years, again, no money. You can't carry on doing these things forever. Right? Eventually, you hit a point where the money actually runs out. By being unwilling to pay for the young, but making them borrow money so that you can, if you like, still have some cruise holidays for the minority of people who can actually afford cruise holidays, because they're renting out houses to families with children, giving them enough income for those cruise holidays. And it tips to a point where people go, this is just wrong. And that's where we are now. I don't know how we're going to get back from it. We end up with a crisis, so special educational needs funding, if it carries on moving where it is in just 3 or 4 years' time, local authorities are bankrupt. They can't run. We've got to this kind of point of a series of crises that aren't going to get to an end. I work in the university sector. It's never been this bad. It's fairly quiet because people don't want to tell you. My university's gone through 4 rounds of redundancies. We don't know if we're going to be merged with another or be the first university to close, because the minute you say that, you are going to be the first university to close because the rumour comes out. Whole set of things that got to the point where they can't carry on anymore. I think we're going to begin to change it round. I can't predict you what the election is going to be in 3 years' time, but I've talked far too long. So please ask me some questions, and if you keep the questions short, I promise to keep my answers short. Thank you. Let's start with you. Yep.
There seems to be a very strong aversion to having a progressive vision, especially in the Labour Party at the moment. How likely is that to change, and how does it change?
I mean, we're in this incredible situation where the Labour Party has gone from 500,000 members to just over 100,000 possibly, or including, and I should say I'm still a member, which a lot of my friends say, how can you be, but I am. It's a very different membership, and a lot of those 100,000 plus are simply lethargic. You know, they're not full of energy, they just don't have the energy to leave. Well, it is. I'm still in the Labour Party because I think the Greens at most could get 50 seats. That's just I could be wrong. I think Labour is your only option, and it changes, and it will change. It will change back again. Watching Andy Burnham, I'm not a particular fan of Andy Burnham, but just watching him go straight for these. If Andy Burnham was Machiavellian, more Machiavellian than he is, he wouldn't open himself up to being accused of being a radical left winger. He'd be Mr. Sensible. But for some reason, he's done that, and it seems strange. There comes a point when you can't carry on selling the same old thing anymore, and that's when you appear to become radical. Classic example would be the National Health Service. There was a Conservative minister involved in helping create it. There was absolutely no way that the country would be able to provide a health service keeping the private and charitable system going. We like to tell a story that it was an Iron Bevan and it was brilliant and it was a model from the Welsh Valleys, but it was actually the only option. It was the only way of doing things after the war, and possibly a lot of men were coming back who knew how to shoot, and that was a concern. Sorry, I promised to keep them short. Should we take the one at the back? No, let's take you and then you.
Yeah, my grandfather helped work with the IBM to build the National Health Service. He designed it. He was one of the designers. And at that time, you remember, even the Tories said that the massive taxes that they were expected to pay at the top was all to do with anti-communism, to keep communism at bay. And it gradually is whatever was going on in the Soviet Union, which too many people are allowed to believe is what Marx and Engels, the whole notion of scientific socialism was being represented in the Soviet Union. Since there's been no sensible defence of that within this country, the anti-communism that now is reflected, even anti-socialism that's reflected now, has complete sway. There's nobody actually explaining to the labour movement that that the future is in its hands. I'm not sure if I'm making this point very clearly, but
Yeah. Yeah.
so I beg one. I think there needs to be an alternative dialogue developed rather than the one that you've done, which doesn't reference to any of the other species and all the pollution that's going on, which I think is what's going to kill us. That's
on the other species and all the pollution that's going on. Well, one thing I think is interesting about our position. There is a country in the world which has begun to reduce its carbon output for the first time last year, and is set to reduce it a lot further. Second biggest producer of carbon in the world. What's the country? China. China's going down already. It may go up slightly, but it's then planned to go down by 2050. We find it really, really difficult to talk about China. We find it really difficult to talk. It's become a bit easier recently because you always used to have to say genocide with China, and now nobody in their right mind, because then you'd have to talk about other genocides. Okay, but over different models and whether they work or not. And I'm not advocating that we have a dictatorial government, almost all of old men, as China has. But it's very hard right now, and this is a change, it's very hard right now to paint China as the great evil nation. People try, and we try in particular, because we got this hang-up about Hong Kong, which we didn't govern in a lovely way. But we have a hang-up, so we keep on reporting. It's very hard to paint China as absolutely terrible. And the other country, which is set to pollute more and more and more, as wonderful, which is our closest ally. You know, we are in the strangest position. And that'll alter the thing. It's not going to suddenly make a whole load of people go, I want the Chinese system. But it's very hard to say that the place that imposes democracy using weapons and aircraft carriers is good, and the place that doesn't invade other countries is terrible and bad. And that opens up a space for thinking about doing things differently. So I think it's a different situation now to what it was, partly because of how China has altered and how America is going downhill so quickly. Is that yours? Yes.
It's interesting what you just said about democracy and defense of democracy, and how in this world where our closest ally is one of the most horrendous regimes in the world, killing people in the streets for the color of their skin and so on. And it's in the context of this genocide that's been going on for the last 2.5 years almost, where if you allow that to take place, how do you expect people to be defending democracy? Like, it is a completely surreal, politically, epoch that we are going through. And I'm surprised that you are not pessimistic, because I think for optimism to occur, you need to have some, at least, signs that our government, since we are talking about Britain, reads the room a little bit, because I think the population on issues that you have so clearly outlined are to the left of our government. People do want better housing, free education. You know, when they are surveyed, they answer all those very basic social democratic measures. Are the population wants them, but the government, our Labour government, isn't hearing that, or isn't interested in responding to the population's.
Or had a game plan, which it may still have, of the option will be reform or us. And possibly, the more like reform we are, the easier it might be to win when the option is reform or us. It's a ridiculous one. It's quite hard to explain what the direction of travel was, unless it was aiming to do that. I mean, on democracy, one of the least democratic democracies in the world is the USA, with its system of 2 senators per state, and how half the population doesn't vote and so on. But we are abysmal. I mean, we got rid of the hereditary peers in the House of Lords, and have started to fill the House of Lords with people who turn out to have slightly dodgy CVs. You know, which is like almost slightly worse than actually just giving it to the oldest son of somebody who happened to be procreated at the same time.
Yes.
Because at least the chance of the oldest son of the Duke being a crook was kind of lower. Whereas, when it comes to, I mean, we really do need to get rid of the but it's entirely wrong to take the UK and the USA, the least democratic countries. We still have clerics. Only Iran has clerics and us in our legislature. It's entirely wrong to take the worst, if you like, democracies, in terms of the least democratic democracies, and say democracy doesn't work. The majority of European countries have seen child poverty falling in the last 7 years, and all have governments run by PR. Lots of things work, it's just not noticed, and nobody in any country goes, look how well we're doing. In every country people say, it's terrible. It's only when you have these international statistics that you see this. Let's take you and then you.
So for the long-suffering social democrat then, look at Spain, for example, run by the socialists. They've taken quite a lot of big gambles recently. One is to sort of give 500,000 undocumented migrants a pathway to citizenship. And following that decision, a week later, they had their worst result in one of their small regions. And you'd think a natural instinct to be able to pull back the drawbridge, and although that was wrong, because we lost all of this region we should have won. And you've got Vox as a big problem there, their far-right equivalent. So why are they doing that? And why are other social democratic parties looking around and saying, well, if Spain can do that, take a risk, still have actual challenges, but stick to their guns because they believe in their principal position, and the other social democratic parties can't in Europe? Why? What's happening differently in Spain that can't happen or translate somewhere else?
Social democracy, of which I am a social democrat, is not that exciting. It isn't people saying we want a revolution. It takes some push. So our government has recently presided over a period where we've had the biggest drop in net migration ever. 400,000 down. We have a total fertility rate of 1.4. And 400,000 down in 1 year. Right? Finland celebrates the migrants coming to Finland. Fertility rate of 1.3. Right? The writing is on the wall. If you've ever lived, I lived for 10 years in Newcastle, but Glasgow, Liverpool, if you lived in cities where the population was falling in the past, you know how impossible it is to do anything. You have to use your tax revenue just to keep basic things going. You can't. It costs lots of money to demolish terrace housing and tower blocks. The snide answer to why isn't it good enough is that it needs people saying it's not good enough and being angry for it to be good enough. So if you ever think it's good, it's much more likely that you've become old and complacent rather than it actually is good. When you look at folk in the past who achieved most over changing things, they tended to be angry and they were not satisfied with what they'd actually done. You at the back.
When Liz Truss announced her tax breaks for the rich, the bond markets and the Bank of England disciplined her, and I wonder the progressive movement that you envisage from Andy Burnham or someone like that, or potentially in the past from Jeremy Corbyn. What would be the situation with the Bank of England and the bond markets then, if that kind of investment that you talk about, is that possible in this climate?
Okay. I'm not an expert. I don't think it was so much the Bank of England. I don't think the Bank of England can act that fast. And you've got to remember the government decided in 1997 to make the Bank of England independent. And it's not that independent. If the government thought that, if the governor of the Bank of England thought that the Prime Minister is going to stay in office, we can make life very hard. But the bond markets was really interesting. And that wasn't predicted at all. Nobody thought that the bond markets would actually look at something which was backed, get the camera, something which was as mad as that, and that the bond markets would say no to Tufton Street. And it was Tufton Street, if you know where that is, number 55 and the other, who were literally imported in to be the advisors for trusts. And there's nothing special about bond markets, and they may not be as scary as we think they are, but they looked at what Truss was doing, they looked at the redistribution of income that was going to come from that budget, and they just said, this country is going to tank, and you want to get out of it. We currently have a fear of bond market policy where you're told you can't do anything because the bond markets won't let you do it. Our taxes are at a 70-year high, but they're still lower than every other European country apart from Ireland and Switzerland. And Ireland and Switzerland are only lower because they have a distorted economy. Switzerland has pharmaceutical industries, Ireland has lots of American firms which make their GDP look bigger and so make the tax take look less. We have a much, much lower tax take than France or Spain or Italy or Germany. The idea that if we move towards being like Germany, which is my really boring, I'd say aim to be like Finland and you might just get to be like Germany. The idea that international finances are going to look at a country that's trying to become like another large European country and go, that won't work, doesn't make sense unless we think we can become like another European country but keep our billionaires untouched. Keep our exclusive education system that's really, really expensive and in my city has the vast majority of school buildings and playing fields, and keep all our second and third homes empty and become like a normal European country. We can't do that. But I cannot see it being impossible. But you need some confidence. And you never know. It is entirely... I don't know, it's not likely to occur. But there is nothing to stop the senior ministers of this government begin to progressively move in that direction. And when you're looking in terms of investing, and that is, are you willing to lend money to this country? If the alternative is that there may be a reform government, and you think that the outcome of a reform government means that there's an increased chance of a default on those loans, then you're unlikely to see it as problematic if Rachel Reeves, for instance, says those arbitrary economic rules that we built up are arbitrary, we're going to change them. Gordon Brown changed them 10 times. I can't see why it's not possible. Part of the reason for this is we are at such an extreme in Europe that becoming slightly more progressive doesn't even make us average. Right? If you were already one of the countries in Europe with the highest tax and spend, Belgium, France, Finland, Norway, and this happened in the past with Sweden, by the way, which had a much higher tax and spend and then brought it down. If you were on the edge of the envelope already and saying we want to become even more progressive, you could see a kind of exodus of money going out, but I think it's unlikely. One trick that those more progressive countries do is they have very small income inequalities. Low-wage jobs are paid much higher than they're paid here. High-wage jobs are paid much less. Right? So you don't have to worry about what kind of work your children do because they'll be generally okay whatever they do. The political trick in Europe is there isn't much touching of the wealth of the wealthy. If you look at house prices in Oslo or Helsinki, they're very high. The wealth of the wealthy is left alone as long as the wealthy leave the country alone and don't try and control its media and don't try and buy its political parties. And it's a deal between the rich and the rest that works. We don't have that. We still have our political parties largely dependent on very rich people to fund them. And we're a long way away. Let's take you.
Thinking about the sort of ideal of equality in education as an aim or drive, does it matter which party is in government?
It hasn't mattered very much since the 1960s. the circular in the 1960s that created the comprehensives was a Labour move. But it hasn't mattered much since then. I'm trying to think who it was. Lord Adonis who introduced the Academies first of all. Okay, supposedly for the poorest school in your town. But, it's a slippery slope to the move for the whole lot. It's quite hard to distinguish between our parties on this. University educational policy, Lord Brown was invited from Shell, I think, or BP. I don't know why, but to do a review. And it went seamlessly from Peter Manson to David Willits. It was as if, and the same with Department for Work and Pensions and benefit policies. David Freud stayed in a position of, he was a minister, he worked in both the Labour and the Conservatives. So there was this ridiculous point where it made very, very little difference, despite Blair saying education, education, education. We don't have the highest number of people in Europe going to universities. According to, I think it's UNICEF, and I can't believe their figure, but it is the official global figure, 43% of young adults in the world are now going to university. When you say it's too many in Britain, 50% going at 18, the UNICEF figure is 43% on the planet. In a sense, the school leaving age is kind of moving up to 21. But our problem with education is so many people are making so much money out of it. Guy Standing is doing a book launch on Tuesday next week. He's got a book about education corruption. The amount of money being taken by academy trusts, being paid in very, very high salaries to the heads of those trusts, so that they can send their children to private schools or boarding schools quite often. The trustees of academies, no longer governors, the trustees being local worthies, again, whose children do not go to these schools. These are what are comprehensive. And universities. I keep on saying £9,000 was introduced. It wasn't 9,000. There was supposed to be a sliding scale from 3 to 9. And if you were a lesser university, you'd only charge 3 or 4. Everybody charged 9. The entire sector got an extra billion. We built a lot of shiny buildings, of the kind you do not see in mainland Europe in their universities. Do universities work less well in the mainland of Europe, where having a shiny building doesn't necessarily help that much? So we have a high degree of, if you like, corruption in our education system. 30% of our secondary school spending is going on private schools, just 7% of kids. Yes, that money comes from the parents, but if you tax them properly, that money will be spread outside. So our education system is weird and bizarre. And it's partly a legacy of empire. It's a brilliant education system to create colonial officers, hierarchy, people you're going to send out. Having universities that you go to by leaving one town and going to another to dislocate you from your family works very well if you've got to go to India next. Right? Having schools like Eton and Harrow work really well if you've got to hold the Khyber Pass. Right? So there is a reason why we have this weird system. But it really doesn't work very well at the moment. And it's costing us a fortune. We've got more teachers per child than any other European country. It's just that most of those teachers are teaching small groups of 10 children in elite private schools. Right? We have more playing fields. We've got more buildings. We've got some buildings with concrete that's going to fall on their heads, but it's madness to have that situation. And the market in universities, you introduce a market into this, or my favourite example is Donald Trump created his own universities, which actually went bankrupt. And they spent more money on marketing than on teaching at Trump University. So you can't, the minute you begin to pay for it, it's no longer education. And that's because if you pay for it, you have to pass. And it doesn't work anymore. You may think you'll have an A star. You'll have a first class degree. You'll have a distinction in your masters. but it doesn't actually mean you've learnt anything anymore. And that's the system that I've been in my entire life. I've watched it go from being was basically a state-funded system with quotas that each university, if they missed by 0.5% for the whole university, they were fined if they took too many or too few. So Newcastle University, Sheffield, absolutely fine. When the quotas went, people flooded to where they thought they wanted to be. There were too many students in those places, too few in others, and now staff that nobody has a sense of security over what they're going to do. And the people who build student accommodation have made an absolute fortune, which possibly half of it is controlled through Guernsey. My favourite example is the area of Manchester that used to be a slum, where Frederick Engels went out with Mary, drew a map of it, is now a complete student village with the most expensive ensuite accommodation on the planet, where you can pay £7,000, £8,000, £9,000 a year for a tiny bedroom but with your own toilet. And the money for that. It's a kind of madness that makes profit for a few people in the short term. But the reason not to get pessimistic about it is it cannot carry on. It doesn't work. And it's based on using people's fears and dreams of what they're going to do. And then they begin to notice. So now you see the anger of people aged 25 or 30, realising how much they're having to pay. And that mounts. And every year there's another cohort. There's 3 million university students. 66% of people go by age 30. Every year there's another million, and their parents and their grandparents looking at this and going, this doesn't work. And I don't think you can keep that going for that long. One way it's kept going is by charging the next set of students even more. So supposing we increase fees to a maximum of 15,000 a year, then everybody who had to pay 9,000 goes, oh, I was lucky, I only had to pay 9,000. Right? But that can't carry on. But there's a danger that that's where we are. You, sir, how much, are we okay for time?
I think we want to go on.
Shall I take 2 more and then stop? Yeah? Or unless you... Or 3, okay. You, sir, and you behind.
Could you say anything about skills-based education? Because I worked with a young lad who did an electrician's course around here and he's dropped out. He didn't think the teacher was very good on it. And I've listened to it on the radio where you get a bricklayer or somebody saying, why would he give up to go and teach? Because he wouldn't earn as much.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, hate to be the one in the room who mentions AI, but a lot of people might need to retrain, and then there's a lot of people not suited to degrees. How is our system doing at the moment in terms of skill-based education, and what could it do to make it better?
We could do better with apprenticeships, and we could have more of them. And the problem is a lot of apprenticeships rely on FE colleges for part of the training, and that's been the lowest paid and the sector that's... but there was a point, I hope I've got this right, but I'm pretty sure I do. I think Michael Gove was the Secretary of State for Education on the day that we nationalised all FE colleges. And they were all sent a letter telling them that they could no longer borrow money because they were part of the Department for Education. So it's incredible what you can... Nobody noticed that because it was Conservatives. But the problem with apprenticeships is FE colleges became part of the Department for Education. And what was unwritten was, as the head of an FE college, could you still pay yourself many more times than the Prime Minister? We have a government that has a policy of a national education service, but the reality of this just depends on your local FE college being good enough to be able to run the electrician's course. I don't like talking about my family, but the reason my oldest son is an electrician, and very luckily for him, one of the FE colleges managed to keep going so he could get trained 18, 19, 20, 21. But it was touch and go as an apprentice electrician, and it shouldn't be like that. And by the way, the pass rate for an electrician is about something like 25%. far, far harder than a university degree. You mustn't kill anybody. Right? AI, I'm willing, I'll make a bet with you that in 5 or 10 years' time, we'll be saying, yes, it was interesting for some things, but the bubble burst, the attempt to hook all these youngsters onto it, so the amount of investment requires the people who are currently hooked on AI, which are mainly under 24, to be willing to pay a subscription soon for using ChatGPT to tell them in the morning what they should do. And it's not that great. Yesterday I was with one of my students who'd used ChatGPT to produce her computer code, and I'm old enough to still be able to look at it and go, that's completely mad, and that's why it's not working. But I'm an old cynic and an old person. I can remember when we first, at Newcastle University, first produced a neural network that could recognise car number plates, and how amazing we thought this was. And I can remember when we first used data from the European Commission, which was really good translations in the EU, to train, again, neural networks to do translations, and how incredible we thought it was. And now you see pictures generated, not all of them, but you go, that's amazing. But it's always a niche particular thing, or producing a standard, middle-of-the-road student essay that isn't that exciting.
I'll take the bet. I hope you will.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, it's you, and then we're stopping. Did you have a question?
I just thought another woman should ask a question, really.
Yeah.
I think it was only Milena so far. So I think just talking about where you started was all about voting, sort of the small politics that we're in at the moment. And I just wonder where you feel emotion plays in that, because you can have as many surveys asking people as many rational questions as you like, but we know that when the majority of people go to the ballot box, they don't actually, I don't think, vote with intellect, they vote with emotion. And how, as we've seen, you know, across Europe, it is a massive issue of the rise of the far right, and it has taken cooperation to keep the far right out in a lot of places. I think we just had good news in Portugal, etc. And how it must be an emotional response that is forcing people to the far right. So what's the emotional response answer we can give to counter that?
There's lots and lots of studies of people going to the polls, and we're quite good at them, because the trick is to ask people the minute they come out of the polling station, and you present them with a polling card to find out what they did. We don't necessarily know why it's a bit like going to church and praying is voting. Apologies for anybody who think that prayers directly work, but the chance of your vote actually altering anything is near zero. So it's slightly a religious act that you do. And we know things that people are much more likely to go and vote if you've got to walk downhill on the way rather than uphill. It's useful to know. On the rise of the far right, so like 14 or 15 years ago, the New York Times began producing an article every year which had bar graphs for every European country on the far right and the rise. And if you remember Golden Dawn, which came a bit after that in Greece, it's now gone, thanks to 2 women judges in particular. When I look at the New York Times list, the far right still fall as fast as they rise. They haven't taken over Poland. Alternative for Deutschland is big in Germany, but hasn't. It's great to be really worried and angry and scared, but the story of the far right rising has been going on for a long time. The tragedy is that just like we were a European country was going to leave the European Union. One was going to leave. We always thought it was going to be a small one. Okay? It turned out to be us. Once we left, nobody else wants to leave because we demonstrated what happens if you leave. And we could be the first European country to actually... I know there's Hungary and other places, but it could... but not France yet. Macron isn't far right. Possibly, but they haven't... They haven't yet. I would put more money on us, to be honest, in France, doing it. Not least because there's more interest from the United States in us. And look at the money coming in. Look at the donations going to reform. You've got to remember, Labour went down in the vote at the last election. Right? It's not from a good position. And the Conservatives did so badly because reform stood everywhere. Emotion really, really matters. But it's possible to, I think, measure these things. And it isn't necessarily that you need a charismatic leader to win. Not on the left. Attlee wasn't charismatic at all. He couldn't do a speech.
They gave massive long speeches.
Yes,
not very good.
Yeah, that's what I mean. He couldn't give a speech that charisma is required on the far right, with the most famous example being in Germany. But the great leader, the wonderful one man who can stand up and do sound bites, that's always a danger on the side of progressive politics, I think. But you do, polling is the most of just how many people bother to vote. And there is a loose correlation with the more equitable a country is, the higher the turnout is over all the countries. Bar something like Australia where you are supposed to vote. Although even in Australia, 10% of people I think don't vote even though they're required to. So I'm always impressed by them. But in general, enthusiasm for voting is higher where the outcome has been better, and falls when life doesn't get better, which is the case in the USA. There's one last one just behind you. Yes, take that one.
You mentioned quite specifically the cost of sending to the councils, and you're right to do so. And those of us who are trade unionists and worked in county halls around the country trying to negotiate different bits of the budget to come our way, that was always very difficult. And we saw the effects of councils having to direct some of their funding from other areas of the council, denuding them of funds as well, just to prop up the failing SEND budget. So this week, the government has announced £5 billion to negate 90% of the SEND debt. So do you think that's going to have a positive effect for a new white paper coming out that might help support schools and local authorities?
It's really tricky. This is the question I'm most likely to offend somebody in the room. If they've got a child who's got a statement. We unleashed something that is unstoppable when we began to do this. So in my county of Oxfordshire, I think roughly half the SEND spending is going to private schools, which is utterly incredible. So we've recreated assisted places, if you like, but as long as you can get a statement. And it's very emotive, and it's about people's particular children. And you get a reality in the school where the school gets more funding if it's got some children who are SEND labelled. They tend to be the middle class children. The children who actually have children who, as my co-author Sally Tomlinson of the Brexit book is most famous for having spent 50 years studying special education, and she describes it children who are rocking, need help, much more likely to be working class children, have no statement at all. So you end up using the money in the school. But the studies that I have seen suggest that this isn't helping anybody very much in the long term at all. That's the most important thing. What you want is an inclusive education where schools are well funded, can cope with a variety of students, where you can go to your local school unless your condition is very, very extreme and do well. And this, ironically, to go back to, I've never done praise for Margaret Thatcher ever.
You've done too much tonight.
Sorry. I think it was Mary Warnock who you mentioned.
Warnock report.
Yeah, Warnock said that every child could be educated. And when Margaret Thatcher was Education Secretary, this was introduced, which is why when I went to school, there were children in wheelchairs in our school for the first time. And the idea was that everybody could go to the school of the neighbourhood you lived in, and the school would cope with that. We need to get back, I think, to that for the good of all the children. Not to be excluded, but the schools need to be funded well enough to do that. the ridiculous irony is that we're already spending this fortune on schools because of the 7% of children going private. I wouldn't ban it. I would just move to a normal European... You could ban it, but even Finland hasn't banned private education. You don't actually need to ban it to get it to almost disappear. So most of mainland Europe has hardly any private schools. They also, by the way, apart from Ireland and Malta, don't have school uniforms in most schools. Yeah? It is possible to educate children without dressing them up in a uniform. But it's also possible. It's possible for your politicians to send their children to the same schools roughly as everybody else, and the quality of education is so much higher. So, when there's a PISA study to end on education, PISA did the International Education Studies. They did one of testing people at age 24. Get them to do maths tests and other tests, but not at the normal school age, at age 24. And I always want to do this with an audience, but I won't do it. We have an education system that's incredibly good at getting somebody what used to be called a C at GCSE or an A at GCSE on the day. But across the whole of the continent, our ability to do basic maths by the age of 24 is one of the worst. Because we have a system of education designed to make a child look good on a day for an exam. And we have an entire continent to look at for better ways. And it's sad that that's the situation. But the state of the system is bringing it to a head. The reason I'm being careful, you can get me afterwards, is that there are always advocacy groups absolutely determined to get more money for their children because of the situation that they're in. But the problem is that they're not getting something that's going to help their child grow up in a country that's working well. And so they're actually going to end up with a worse situation. But it's... And I would like ministers to actually say what we want overall in 20, 30, 40 years' time, so that this country works. I always think one way to try and convince people who are fairly selfish and right-wing not to be is, and if they're old and if you've got children, think of your weakest grandchild. Don't think of the relative who's doing okay, has started their business, all that. Think of the weakest member of your family and what's going to happen to them. And this isn't asking people to be nice and think about other people. It's still selfish. It's just about your family. Think about what's going to happen to them. Are they going to be homeless in future if we carry on like this? As a way to try to get through emotionally to people who find it hard to be kind to strangers. And you cannot protect your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren in future because you're not going to be around. But if you allow the country to carry on as it is, they're very likely to be in a very terrible situation. And all of your offspring and your cousins and your nephews and nieces, they're not all going to be winners. And those winners don't necessarily make things better for everybody else, which is why when Margaret Thatcher signed that target in 1986, she didn't achieve it, because she thought that by letting a few people win and taxing them low, it would trickle down and help everybody. Right? She honestly believed it, and it didn't. And we can learn from this. We can learn from our past, and we can learn from what's happening in other places. And I'm generally optimistic, but it's a kind of good week because the more I hear about Peter Mandelson, the happier I get. So thank you very much.
That was brilliant, and I'll hand over to Ed, who's the national president of the NEU and who was the branch secretary here in Haringey.
Yeah, and I won't keep you long. As Zina says, I was Julie's successor as the secretary here in Haringey. I was really interested to hear Danny talk at the beginning of his speech about how much progress can be made in 16 years. Because 16 years ago, Michael Gove walked into the DFE and soon after walked into Tottenham. And there are people in this room who were instrumental with Julie in fighting back against the plans that Michael Gove had for Tottenham children and Tottenham schools. And really that legacy of fighting is how I will always remember Julie, and it's so telling to see people here who are family, who are activists, who are teachers, who are politicians, and who are fighters, because Julie was all of those things to so many people, and I think she would be immensely proud to see so many of you here, probably a little embarrassed as well, but immensely proud to see so many of you here, and should be immensely thankful to Danny for his time and really fascinating political discussion. So thank you very much for coming, and another round of applause for Danny.